Chapter 6. The Process of Evolution. Development of Animal Intelligence. It remains to examine the process by which this development has been brought about. It has already been shown that the objective mind is the educator of the subjective mind. It is fitted for that office by virtue of the fact that its power of inductive reasoning qualifies it to act intelligently in an imperfect environment, for it possesses the faculty of judicial discrimination. In saying this, I must not be understood as affirming that the objective mind performs its function of induction to the exclusion of instinct. I am not of those who believe, with Cuvier, that instinct and intelligence stand in an inverse ratio with each other. Darwin and other modern biologists agree with Pouchet that no such inverse ratio exists. On the contrary, as the latter points out, those insects which possess the most wonderful instincts are certainly the most intelligent. Asterisk again. Darwin shows that in the vertebrate series the least intelligent members, namely fishes and amphibians, do not possess complex instincts, and amongst mammals the animal most remarkable for its instincts, namely the beaver, is highly intelligent. In fact, I do not know of a modern biologist who does not now admit that animals possessing the most complex instincts invariably possess a correspondingly high order of objective intelligence. I make these references for the reason that, as far as they go, they bear me out in what I shall proceed to show, and that is that complex instincts and intelligence are exactly proportioned to each other in all the broad realm of sentient life, beginning with the animal in which a brain was first developed and ending with the most highly endowed human being. This is true for the simple reason that high intelligence and complex instincts sustain a causal relation to each other. That is to say, in any given class or species, the more highly developed the objective mind becomes, the more complex become the instincts, for the former is the cause of the latter. And this is brought about solely by the development of secondary instincts. In order to make myself clearly understood in this connection, I must revert to what has already been said in relation to the distinction between primary and secondary instincts as laid down by Romanes and others. Not that I agree with Romanes as to the origin of primary instincts, for his doctrine relegates the whole question to the realm of chance. But his general statement of the origin of secondary instincts is obviously correct as far as it goes. He explains their origin as follows: by the effects of habit in successive generations, actions which were originally intelligent become, as it were, stereotyped into permanent instincts. This is what Lewis calls the lapsing of intelligence, a term that is liable to mislead in the absence of explanation. The meaning is this: after an intelligent action has been performed for a certain length of time, it is converted into an instinct, and as such it is transmitted by inheritance, and succeeding generations perform the action automatically, that is, without intelligence. Then intelligence has lapsed. As before remarked, I accept Romane's general statement of the origin of secondary instincts, or rather his definition of such instincts, because it is obviously correct. He does not, however, make the distinction quite clear between primary and secondary instincts as he defines the former. Nor does he give us any clue whatever leading to a knowledge of the time when or the means by which secondary instincts began to be developed. His want of clearness of distinction between the two classes is well illustrated in his selection of an illustration of the origin of primary instincts. In order that I may be sure to do no injustice to the learned author, I will quote the entire passage relating to the origin and development of primary instincts. The first mode of origin consists in natural selection, or survival of the fittest, continuously preserving actions which, although never intelligent, yet happen to have been of benefit to the animals which first chanced to perform them. Thus, for instance, take the instinct of incubation. It is quite impossible that any animal can ever have kept its eggs warm with the intelligent purpose of hatching out their contents. So we can only suppose that the incubating instinct began by warm-blooded animals showing that kind of attention to their eggs which we find to be frequently shown by cold-blooded animals. Thus, crabs and spiders carry about their eggs for the purpose of protecting them. And if, as animals gradually became warm-blooded, some species, for this or for any other purpose, adopted a similar habit, the imparting of heat would have become incidental to the carrying about of the eggs. Consequently, as the imparting of heat promoted the process of hatching, those individuals which most constantly cuddled or brooded over their eggs would, other things equal, have been the most successful in rearing progeny. and so the incubating instinct would be developed without there ever having been any intelligence in the matter. It is difficult to see how the learned author is enabled to arrive at the conclusion that there never could have been any intelligence in the matter, in view of the fact that the steps involved in the education of the animal, as he describes that process, presuppose a long series of intelligent observations as to the best conditions of successful incubation, followed by the intelligent adoption of the plan that had proved to be productive of the best results, and the subsequent stereotyping of that process into permanent instincts. It is obvious that the series of observations and experiments required by this variety of the theory of natural selection would have involved the exercise of far higher inductive powers than were employed in formulating the theory. The intense absurdity of the latter can be fully appreciated only when we reflect that the eggs of warm-blooded animals require a definite time for incubation, during which time they must be kept at a given temperature continuously. Any great or long-continued lapse from continuity in the temperature is necessarily fatal to the life within the egg. This law was in existence at the time when the supposed series of observations was being conducted. Every egg that was hatched during that time was, therefore, subjected to the necessary conditions of continuous heat. In the meantime, the experimenters in various degrees of coddling and brooding must have died without issue. And it is obvious that if they had all been experimenters, the class would have become extinct with the first generation. The fact that they did not become extinct is demonstrative that some of the eggs were subjected to the necessary continuous temperature at the very beginning, and that the process has been kept up ever since. The only other supposition that could possibly account for the origin of the instinct of incubation on the theory of natural selection is that the first warm-blooded animal that hatched a brood must have accidentally sat on her eggs continuously during the necessary period of incubation, say 3 weeks. The word accidentally is advisedly used, for the Darwinian theory of natural selection is the theory of accident, the hypothesis of chance, and this is the theory which Romanes, in the passage above quoted, avowedly adopts as his explanation of the origin of primary instincts. His words are these: the first mode of origin consists in natural selection, or survival of the fittest, continuously preserving actions which, though never intelligent, yet happen to have been of benefit to the animals which first chanced to perform them. It is superfluous to remark that the supposition that the process of incubation began by an accidental sitting by the parent animal of, say, 3 weeks' duration is in a very high degree improbable, to employ no harsher expression in its characterization. But the very last degree of improbability is reached when we stop to consider all that is involved in the theory of accidental incubation. Thus, the continuity of the requisite temperature is presupposed, as any serious lapse would be fatal to the embryo. This, in turn, involves a continuous sitting, which would be fatal to the parent, and must therefore be dismissed as impossible. The only alternate supposition is that the parent leaves the nest at least once a day to procure the necessary food to sustain life. But this, in turn, involves the accidental return to the nest each day, in time to prevent the eggs from getting cold. Again, if prehistoric eggs required the same attention and manipulation that modern fowls find it profitable to bestow upon those of current history, we must suppose that they required daily turning over in the nest. This, of course, involves the supposition that each of the first collection of prehistoric eggs was accidentally turned each day for the required period of incubation. Nor is this all, for this congeries of accidents must, of necessity, have been repeated by the next generation, and the next, and so on for an indefinite period, before the acts became stereotyped into permanent instincts. This, however, is inferential, since our learned author has not vouchsafed the information as to how many repetitions of a favoring accident are required to convert it into a permanent instinct. But he does tell us what Darwin had previously laid down as a general principle, that intelligent actions, after being performed during several generations, become converted into instincts and are inherited, as when birds on oceanic islands learn to avoid man. If therefore it requires several generations to convert an intelligent action into an inheritable secondary instinct, we have a right to infer that it will require at least an equal number of generations to convert an accident into a permanent primary instinct, a fortiori, when it was developed, as Romanes assures us the instinct of incubation was developed, without there ever having been any intelligence in the matter. But as it is reasonably certain that no such series of accidents, with an indefinite number of exact repetitions, ever did or ever could occur, we are driven to the conclusion that the learned author must hold that the accidental experience of one individual will be sufficient to stereotype the instinct and render it permanent, and this, too, in the absence of any intelligence whatever. But as that is manifestly impossible in the absence of a very high order of intelligence, it must be dismissed as untenable in fact, as well as inconsistent with the learned author's own premises. In point of fact, any view that can be taken of the question from the standpoint of the theory of natural selection involves the predication of such a long series of accidents that the mere enumeration of them is a reductio ad absurdum. In the meantime, I must not be understood as rejecting the general Darwinian doctrine of natural selection. Much less do I reject the Lamarckian doctrine of appetency. Least of all do I sympathize with that spirit of partisanship that accepts either theory to the exclusion of the other. They are both required, and much more besides, in any system of inductive philosophy that is capable of accounting for all the facts of organic and mental evolution. What I object to is the attempt of materialism to overload any one theory with burdens that do not belong to it. It is in this spirit that I have ventured to draw attention to one or two of the many reasons for rejecting the doctrine that primary instincts have their origin in natural selection. The illustrations of the absurdity of that hypothesis might be multiplied indefinitely were it worthwhile to do so. I have used the instinct of incubation as an illustration simply because Romanes, by using it, tacitly admitted that it was best suited to his purpose. I will content myself with one more illustration. The instinct of reproduction is certainly a primary instinct. It was fully developed in the first unicellular organism. Else there never could have been a second unicellular organism, and the process of evolution of animal life would have ceased at the very threshold of sentient existence. The process of reproduction by unicellular organisms is by fission or segmentation. That is, the cell separates into two equal parts, each of which is a complete cell, endowed with all the attributes of the original cell. Now, in order to account for the origin of the primary instinct of reproduction on the theory of natural selection, we must suppose that an accident happened to the original cell resulting in splitting it in two in the middle. Then we must suppose that each half gathered itself together, took account of stock, and discovered, accidentally of course, that there was enough left to constitute a quorum, so to speak, and to complete an independent organism. The subsequent steps by which this accident was converted into a permanent instinct I leave to be decided by those who believe that the theory of natural selection, or the hypothesis of chance, is a sufficient explanation of all the phenomena incident to the progressive development of the organic world. It is, however, useless to waste time in showing the absurdity of supposing that the instincts of primordial unicellular organisms owed their origin to natural selection, for I do not know that any biologist of prominence now seriously entertains that theory. The point I wish to make is that since some primary instincts of the most important character are inherent in the mental organism of animals, there is no valid reason for supposing that other primary instincts owe their origin to natural selection. One of the primary rules of scientific investigation is that we should never needlessly multiply causes. That is to say, where an adequate cause of any class of phenomena is known to exist, we have neither occasion nor logical right to seek other causes for the same or cognate phenomena. Now, we know that many of the primary instincts are inherent in the mental organism of animals. It is unnecessary, therefore, to invoke any other theory to account for any primary instinct, at least until it is first shown that the known cause is inadequate to explain all the phenomena. Until, therefore, the contrary is demonstrated, we may safely assume that the instinct of incubation in warm-blooded animals arises from the same irresistible impulse that impels the lower animals to the acts of reproduction or nutrition, or any of the other acts necessary to self-preservation. It may, in fact, be safely assumed to be a law of evolutionary development, in the absence of proof or reason to the contrary, that every new species evolved is endowed with primary, that is, inherent, instincts adapted to its use and necessities. Were this not true, each new species would perish before natural selection could select. I have dwelt at some length upon this branch of the subject for the reason that I desire to make the distinction clear between primary and secondary instincts. This has never been done heretofore. and it seems probable that the unnecessary exploitation of the theory of natural selection as an explanation of the origin of some of the primary instincts has arisen from the want of a clear apprehension of this distinction. In point of fact, in the hazy atmosphere of the old psychologies, it was impossible to perceive clearly the line of delimitation between the two classes of instincts. In other words, it was impossible, under the old psychology, to assign a specific, exclusive cause for the development of secondary instincts. This is the crucial question, for when that is known, the distinction instantly becomes apparent. I have quoted with approval Romaine's very general statement of the origin of secondary instincts. Briefly stated, it is that habit converts actions that were originally intelligent into permanent instincts. But he does not tell us what was the specific agency that enabled animals to perform intelligent actions that are so far distinct from the ordinary instinctive, automatic actions of animals that it requires generations of habitual performance to convert them into permanent instincts. Obviously, there is a clear line of demarcation somewhere between the two distinct classes of actions, and that the classes are so divergent in their nature, so antithetical in their characteristics, that it is impossible to refer them to a common origin. What that distinction is, the intelligent reader who has followed me thus far has already anticipated. The following propositions will define my position with sufficient clearness to enable the reader to perceive the significance of the facts which will be adduced in this and in later chapters. 1. Primary instincts are those which are inherent in the mental organism of animals in their native environment. They exist antecedent to reason, experience, or instruction, and are transmitted to posterity by inheritance. They include all that were possessed by animals prior to the development of a brain organism. 2. Secondary instincts all have their origin in that intelligence of which the brain is the organ, and are the result of the reaction of that intelligence upon a new or a changed environment. 3. They become permanent instincts after being performed for several generations, and are then inherited the same as primary instincts, Darwin. It will now be seen, by an examination of the facts, that the distinctions above made exactly accord with the history of organic evolution as set forth by Haeckel and other great lights of evolutionary science. No such thing as a secondary instinct has been shown to have existed prior to the advent of animal life upon dry land. A brain did not exist during the primordial epoch. During the next epoch, a brain began to be developed, and, simultaneously therewith, fern forests appeared upon land, thus rendering it habitable for animal life, and at the same time providing the material for the carboniferous strata which now furnish our supplies of coal and petroleum. And it is a significant fact that it was during the Carboniferous period that some fishes began to accustom themselves to live upon land, and thus gave rise to the amphibian class. 1 here, then, are 3 coincidental facts of profound significance, namely, a. the development of a brain, b. the development of conditions favorable to the sustentation of animal life upon dry land, and c. the advent of the amphibian class, the earliest terrestrial and air-breathing animals. 2 now, unless we rest content to adopt the hypothesis of chance to account for these facts, we must infer, 1. that a brain was developed in response to a rapidly approaching necessity for a change of environment, and 2. that such a change became possible by the simultaneous development of a. terrestrial conditions rendering it possible for animal life to be sustained on dry land, and b. a mental organism capable of intelligently responding to those conditions. Accordingly, we find, as before remarked, 1. that a brain was developed during the Second, or Paleolithic epoch, 2. that during the Middle Paleolithic epoch, or Carboniferous period, fern forests and air-breathing animals simultaneously appeared. This was the first step in brain development in advance of that of the fishes. It was a small step, it is true, for the amphibia are but very little more intelligent than their immediate ancestors, but it was the beginning of a vastly more rapid development than was possible in a purely aquatic environment. The reader is again referred to the table in Chapter 5, showing the percentages of time consumed in the development of the various orders and classes of animals before and after the development of a brain. It is obvious, at a glance, that the constantly increasing rapidity of development, as shown by the table, must be a fact of profound significance. And when we consider it in connection with the general principle laid down by Darwin and the other authorities quoted, that animals possessing the highest intelligence have the most complex instincts, we are prepared to understand the exact function which the brain performs in the development of animal intelligence. We are also enabled to locate the dividing line between primary and secondary instincts and to understand the process by which the latter are primarily developed and finally become fixed and inheritable attributes of the mind. The following propositions are, therefore, provisionally submitted. 1. The intelligent actions to which Darwin and Romanes refer as the basis of secondary instincts are, in all cases, prompted by that intelligence of which the brain is the organ, namely, the objective mind. 2. The inciting causes of the activity and consequent development of the brain intelligence of the lower animals are changes of environmental conditions. 3. It follows, a. that all instincts possessed by animals prior to the development of a brain are primary instincts. b. That all instincts originally possessed by any given species are, in effect, primary instincts, even though the species itself may be the result of ancestral development of secondary instincts. And c. That animal intelligence is necessarily proportioned to complexity of environmental conditions. Enough has already been said to show, prima facie, that the first proposition is true, the table alone presenting sufficient a priori grounds to sustain that theory. If, therefore, the a posteriori reasons point to the same conclusion, the question may be considered as settled. The three propositions will be considered together. In the first place, it is very evident that the slow progress of development during the primordial epoch was due to two causes, namely, 1. The purely aquatic environment, which allowed but little variation of conditions, and 2. The absence of brain development, which alone is able to take intelligent advantage of any variation in environmental conditions. The second, or primary, epoch presented a new condition, in that vegetable life was developed on dry land. But there was still only a limited variety of environmental conditions. It was the age of fern forests, a gigantic vegetal growth of practically one genus. It afforded a temporary refuge for some of the more highly endowed fishes, and hence the gradual development of the amphibia. But the conditions on dry land at that time were even more monotonous than in the sea, and hence the inconceivably slow progress of development of animal life and intelligence. It required, as the table shows, more than 32% of the time consumed since the beginning of organic life on this planet to develop the amphibia, or, rather, to reach a higher order than the amphibia. In other words, it required untold millions of years to perfect that step in the process of organic evolution, notwithstanding the fact that it was taken in pursuance of an originally intelligent purpose, as distinguished from an instinctive impulse. It was, in fact, when fishes began to accustom themselves to live upon dry land that the first step was taken in the development of a secondary instinct. It was the first intelligent action of the brain-mind that has left its impress upon the organic world. It certainly was not a primary instinct that impelled a fish to abandon its native element even temporarily. It was an intelligent action, in pursuance of an intelligent purpose. It was, moreover, an enterprise of great pith and moment, and one that was deliberately taken, and often repeated, through several generations, before it was stereotyped into a permanent instinct. The theory of natural selection cannot be invoked to account for the beginning of that instinct, for it could not have been the result of an accident. It is a matter of common observation that when a fish is accidentally thrown upon dry land, he loses no time in working his way back to his native element, and he is not prone to repeat the experiment of his own volition. There could not, therefore, be the slightest tendency toward a hereditary transmission of terrestrial habits as the result of an accidental or enforced sojourn upon dry land. The tendency, in fact, would be to reinforce the primary instinct which impels fishes to remain in their native element. We must therefore exclude accident, or the element of chance, as a possible factor in the development of that secondary instinct which brought into being and perpetuated the amphibia. In making this exclusion, we thereby also exclude natural selection, or survival of the fittest, as the cause of the development of that particular genus. And I may here remark, parenthetically, that natural selection, or survival of the fittest, is not, properly speaking, the original cause of variation in, or origin of, species. I do not deny that it is a factor of the utmost importance, but it is not an original cause. It is not even a law of nature, strictly speaking, for natural law is properly defined as the uniform occurrence of natural phenomena in the same way or order under the same conditions. The term survival of the fittest does not describe a uniform occurrence of natural phenomena. On the contrary, it is made to cover a great variety of phenomena, some of them of exactly opposite character to others. Thus, among animals, other things being equal, those possessing the greatest strength are the ones that survive. In some cases, it means a survival of the swiftest. Among the higher animals, it is often the most sagacious, as in man. Among nations, it was formerly a question of numbers and the physical prowess of the private soldier, and it was thus that the fittest to survive were the barbarous hordes that destroyed the civilization of ancient Rome. In modern times, the most skillful men behind the biggest guns are the survivors, physical strength being a factor of the least importance. As between savages and civilized men in times of peace, the fittest to survive are those who require the least area of land from which to draw their sustenance. Thus, the North American Indian required a vast territory to supply him with the necessary game to enable him to live, while his civilized neighbor could sustain himself in comfort on a few acres of land. But in war, the modern appliances of warfare place the savages at a disadvantage. As between different races living together and sustaining peaceful relations, the fittest to survive may be the ones who can live and labor on the least or the cheapest food. Thus, the Chinaman, who can live on a handful of rice per day, once threatened to starve the American laborer to death, and would have done so but for the passage of laws restricting Chinese immigration. In that case, the inferior race would have been the fittest, and he would have survived the wreck of our civilization. But, with the passage of that law, the conditions of survival were instantly reversed, for our ability to enforce that law depended upon our superior military and naval strength, notwithstanding the disparity in numbers. It will thus be seen that the so-called law of survival of the fittest is not a law of nature, but a condition, an incident, and not a primary cause. It is an effect of other and far deeper and more important causes. In saying this, I must not be understood as seeking to eliminate natural selection or the survival of the fittest as a factor in the progressive development of organic life. Far from it. That theory is indispensable in any hypothesis which seeks to account for the existence of the organic world on principles of evolutionary development. What I wish to show is that the theory is overloaded with burdens that do not properly belong to it, but, more particularly, that it is a condition the causes of which must themselves be accounted for on other grounds than those set forth by Darwin and his followers. As before stated, theirs is the doctrine of chance. Eliminate that element from the Darwinian theory, and there is little left of it. Not that I would undertake to eliminate that factor entirely from the process of evolutionary development. No one who has intelligently observed the progressive development of varieties of species among domestic animals can doubt the fact that the element of accident or chance has entered very largely into the process. Almonds, breeders of domestic animals, this element is largely, though not entirely, eliminated by intelligent artificial and sexual selection. But domestication itself is an accident. That is to say, it is out of the natural order and the result of fortuitous circumstances. We may, therefore, give due credit to the element of accident and fortuitous changes of environment, which is much the same thing, for a large part of the phenomena of variation of species. And we may also give the theory the benefit of the doubt in many cases where the question of the origin of species is involved. Since it is often difficult to determine whether two given animals belong to different species or represent extreme variations of the same species. It will become evident, however, as we proceed, that the element of chance is a less potent factor in the origin of species than it is in the production of morphological variations. That it is still less in the origin of genera than in that of species. That, in short, the farther we go back in the history of organic evolution, the less potent is the element of chance, and the more potent is the element of intelligence, that is, instinctive intelligence, as a factor in the progressive development of the organic world. Nevertheless, we cannot wholly eliminate fortuitism at any given stage, for it is obvious that many changes of environmental conditions may occur which animal intelligence cannot have originated, e.g., when a great cataclysm of nature segregates a genus or a species from the parent stock or its native environment. This is somewhat of a digression, but it became necessary in order to define clearly the issue between fortuitism which is the argument of Darwin, Haeckel, and their followers, and the teleological argument of which I am building the foundation out of their own materials. With that class of reasoners, chance is everything, especially everything of a causal nature. It is veiled under a multitude of words of learned length and scientific sound, but the last analysis of their argument reveals chance as their ultimate as well as their proximate cause. Thus, they assume that it was a fortuitous juxtaposition and final union of certain chemical elements that produced a living organism endowed with a mind, Haeckel. It was fortuitism that developed the primary instincts, Romanes. It was a series of accidents that was responsible for the origin of species, Darwin. It will now be seen that the whole trend and tendency of their argument is to place organism in advance of intelligence, physical structure in advance of mind. The obvious reason for this attitude is that the clear, analytical mind of Darwin easily foresaw that if it were once admitted that mind sustained, in any degree whatsoever, a causal relation to physical structure, the admission, carried to its legitimate conclusion, would make for teleology or theism. It thus becomes obvious why Darwin so contemptuously rejected the Lamarckian doctrine of appetency, which was, in a less clearly defined form, also held by his own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin. The Lamarckian theory is summed up with sufficient clearness for our present purpose by Geddes, in his article on variation and selection in the Encyclopaedia Britannica, in words following. The well-known theory of Lamarck laid special emphasis on function and environment, for, though the sense of need in association with suitable environment calls out a succession of efforts, and so originates incipient structural modifications, it is to increased functioning that the increase of these modifications must be ascribed, while similarly disuse explains degeneration. Changed conditions produce new wants, nutritive and reproductive, hence changes in climate, or the like, change the organism by changing its habits. Rapid increase is checked by other organisms. The strongest and best armed for attack devour the weaker, and the less perfect genera are kept down by the more perfect. It will thus be seen that the gist of Lamarck's theory was that changes of physical structure are brought about in response to impulses from within, which impulses arise from the necessities imposed by environment. Lamarck illustrates the principle in the following words. I conceive that a gastropod mollusk, which, as it crawls along, finds the need of touching the bodies in front of it, makes the effort to touch those bodies with some of the foremost parts of its head, and sends to these every time quantities of nervous fluids as well as other liquids. I conceive, I say, that it must result from this reiterated afflux towards the points in question that the nerves which but at these points will, by slow degrees, be extended. Now, as in the same circumstances other fluids of the animal flow also to the same places, and especially nourishing fluids, it must follow that 2 or more tentacles will appear in 142 the divine pedigree of man, develop insensibly in those circumstances on the points referred to. Now, if it be objected that such a process of growth would require very many generations to perfect the tentacles of a gastropod mollusk, it may well be asked how long it would take to perform the same feat under natural selection. In other words, how many accidents of a similar character, occurring in the same family, in successive generations, would be required to endow a species permanently with tentacles. The long neck of the giraffe has also been used to illustrate the Lamarckian theory, the necessities of its environment and the nature of its daily food requiring that animal to reach to the higher branches of trees in search of sustenance. In view of the facts that modern science has experimentally developed regarding the unlimited power of the subjective mind of man over the functions, sensations, and conditions of his body, it requires no effort of imagination or of credulity, no soaring into regions of speculative philosophy, to arrive at the conclusion that the active agency of development resides within all sentient creatures, and that accident plays but a very subordinate part in the process of organic evolution. Volumes might be filled with illustrative experiments made by scientists demonstrating the power of the subjective mind over the body, its power of modifying function, increasing or decreasing the circulation of the blood, of causing or allaying fevers, of healing or of causing lesions, as in bloody stigmata, Bernheim, or of its power over diseases in general, but the reader must be referred to the current literature on the subject. It must suffice to remark that the evidence is sufficient to warrant the provisional assumption that the subjective, or instinctive, Minds of animals have the power of so modifying the structure of their bodies by constant refunctioning of particular parts as to produce, in the course of time, new organs adapted to the exigencies of physical environment. If we reason from the ontogeny of the individual to the phylogeny of the species, the evidence becomes conclusive in many instances. As this method of reasoning is constantly insisted upon by the ablest biologists as being demonstrative, we will cite an instance in point. It is well known that some insects, a few batrachians, and many fishes possess the power of changing their colors to conform to that of their immediate surroundings. This is done for the purpose of concealment from natural enemies, and the power, especially among fishes, is wonderfully near perfection. With some species, a great variety of colors and color combinations seems to be at instant command. Now, it is obvious that this power of instantaneous change is brought about by an instinctive impulse. It is an adaptation of means to ends of so pronounced and varied a character that reflex action cannot be invoked as an explanation. Reasoning, therefore, from ontogeny to phylogeny, we must suppose that the faculty is the result of an instinctive impulse. And this is true whether we classify the instinct as primary or secondary. In other words, the impulse which caused the necessary 144 the divine pedigree of man. Structural growth was from within, and mind preceded organism and function. It will thus be seen that the Lamarckian doctrine of appetency is a necessary factor in any theory of progressive development of animal life that is competent to explain all the facts. Neither the Darwinian theory of natural selection nor the Lamarckian doctrine of appetency is complete without the other. The latter, indeed, bears a causal relation to the former, and it explains all that the doctrine of natural selection leaves unexplained. Moreover, appetency is a law of nature. Natural selection is not no amount of sophistry. No weight of great names or authority can invest a series of accidents with that dignity. Moreover, a series of accidents, however numerous or important, can neither cause nor adequately explain the orderly, progressive development of anything, much less the evolution of a universe, or a planet, or of humanity. It requires a law to do that, and to Lamarck is due the credit of having made a partial discovery of that law. It will now be seen that the true relation which Lamarckism and Darwinism sustain to each other is this. The law of appetency underlies the phenomena of natural selection. This will be further elucidated in subsequent chapters. It remains to explain the modus operandi of the Lamarckian law, and this brings us back to the proposition set forth just before the beginning of this digression. Briefly restated, the gist of the propositions is this: progressive development of animal intelligence and concomitant structural changes are primarily due to the constant accretion of secondary instincts, the latter being the result of the development of the brain intelligence, and this, in turn, being due to a constantly increasing complexity of environmental conditions. The latter clause of the proposition will not be disputed after a moment's reflection. It is a matter of common experience and observation that, other things being equal, the culture and consequent progress of each individual depends largely, if not wholly, upon environmental conditions. The mute, inglorious Miltons who people the country churchyards differed from the author of Paradise Lost only because of the difference of environment. The farmer's son who forsakes the parental roof and becomes great and honored, who commands the applause of listening senates or wades through slaughter to a throne, may possess no more native talent than the brother who chooses to remain at home to break the stubborn glebe and inherit the homely joys and destiny obscure of his rude forefathers. The difference is due to a changed environment, whether the change be the result of accident, or of necessity, or of deliberate choice. Be that as it may, the fact remains that the greater complexities of the new environment furnish the stimuli to that culture which constitutes intelligent adaptation. There are, of course, vast differences in the capacity of individuals to adapt themselves to new environments, and it is this difference that determines the question of survival of the fittest. In any event, it is an impulse from within that constitutes the motive power of progressional development. The same rules hold good in the realm of animal life. It is a change of environment that furnishes the stimulus to mental growth, and consequently, the more complex the new environment, the greater the stimulus, and the more rapid the progress toward intelligent adaptation to the new conditions. And as it is with a man, so it is with an animal. Its ability to adapt itself to, and to take intelligent advantage of, new environmental conditions constitutes the effective factor in its progressive development. Now, as the instinct of self-preservation is one of the two generic primary instincts common to all sentient creatures, it follows that the salient features of any new environment in which one of the lower animals finds itself, and which stimulate its mental activity, consist of new dangers to be encountered and new methods of obtaining sustenance. These conditions must be met intelligently, if at all successfully. The primary instincts which belong to the animal in its native environment are useless to it when new dangers are encountered. In other words, the subjective mind, owing to its limitations, is not capable of coping with new conditions. But the objective, or brain, mind is specially adapted to that exigency, and as soon as it has learned the source of danger, it intelligently avoids it in the future. When this intelligent action has been performed for a few generations, it becomes converted into an instinct and is then inherited. Instances have already been cited. This, then, is the way that secondary instincts are created or evolved. It must be remarked, in this connection, that old instincts are lost whenever the conditions of a new environment render them no longer useful, as in the case of animals that have been domesticated. We are now prepared to understand the full significance of the geometrically increasing ratio of development of animal intelligence after a brain became a factor in the process of evolution. Each successive epoch being distinguished by a constantly augmenting fauna, the environment was correspondingly increased in complexity. As dangers multiplied, the difficulty of obtaining food increased, and the consequence was that sagacity became a factor of constantly increasing importance. Even the larger carnivora, whose strength and ferocity rendered them irresistible in open warfare, were compelled to resort to strategic measures to secure their prey from among the weaker but swifter or more sagacious animals. The latter were compelled to exercise their sagacity, not only in securing nourishment, but in constantly guarding against dangers arising from contact with other animals who were armed with superior weapons of offensive and defensive warfare. Thus, it happens that, as Darwin declares, and all other intelligent naturalists admit, Cuvier accepted, animals possessing the most wonderful instincts are certainly the most intelligent. In the meantime, the Lamarckian law prevailed, each newly acquired instinct affecting a corresponding modification of physical structure, which, in the fullness of time and amplitude of development, constituted either new genera or new species. Incidentally, natural selection tended to preserve those animals which were the most highly endowed, physically or mentally. In other words, the so-called law of survival of the fittest is an incidental result of that struggle for life which followed the evolution of antagonistic genera and species under the law of appetency. It will thus be seen that mind was, in all cases, antecedent to, and the cause of, structural changes. It must not be forgotten, however, that it was the subjective, or instinctive, mind that affected all progressive development, from the monarch to man. The objective, or brain, mind is, and always has been, the educator of the subjective mind. That is to say, by its intelligent action in emergencies it constantly originated new or secondary instincts, and these, in turn, became a part of the subjective mental equipment of the animal, and, by inheritance, of the species to which it belonged. In the meantime, each instinct, primary or secondary, continues to form an inheritable part of the mental equipment of a species as long as it is useful. The mental equipment, therefore, of each individual animal, other things being equal, comprises the sum total of all its ancestral instincts that remain useful, plus its objective, or reasoning, intelligence. Hence it is that the great bulk of the aggregate of animal intelligence consists of that consolidated, correlated congeries of primary and secondary instincts which has been inherited from its ancestry, near and remote.